Welcome back to the Monday evening edition of Power Business. We are here together until 8 p.m. My name is Kasi Tole. Yesterday, the president addressed the nation, and part of his address was some of the concessions that the government will be making. I suppose the most important one is indeed the restoration of the 350 Rand social relief distress grant, which we now know has helped a lot of people when it was first issued. It will now be rolled out again until March 2022. So we're hoping that those who qualify will indeed be able to access it without too much stress. We know that also in some places where people used to be able to access it through a post office infrastructure, for example, some of those post offices have been burned down and looted, so it'll be a bit of a challenge for them to know where to go. But of course, it is a step in the right direction, and the question around the universal basic income grant is definitely going to be on the table even beyond March 2022. The other important message that emerged from the president came on the issue of taxes. So suddenly a lot of people were worried or maybe excited about whether it meant that taxes were going to be cut. So we decided we're going to have someone who understands matters of tax quite well, much better than we do. And this is Jashwin Baijoo, who's a legal manager of Africa Tax and Compliance at Tax Consultancy SA. Good evening, Jashwin.
Hey, good evening, Kaya. It's good to catch up with you again after the Cypher breakfast. How are you doing?
Yes. It's been a while. Thank you very much. Yeah, yesterday, the question of, the concessions that government has been making in relation to issues of tax left a lot of people a bit intrigued, if nothing else. And the first one that I'd like to sort of deliberate with you on is a question of PAYE. What exactly did the president say, and what does it mean?
Yeah, so, Kaya, I'm not sure if you recall, but last year, there was an implementation by Sars and by government, by extension National Treasury, of a COVID-19 relief mechanism. So how this operated was on a company's monthly statement from Sars, it would actually reflect the COVID-19 relief mechanism. And I very much think that's what the president is angling towards, because this was implemented last year and was very successful in keeping many SMEs afloat. And at this stage, it's something that's quite necessary, and especially in light of the riots from earlier in July, where many small businesses actually suffered the most. So what we're looking at here is kind of a relief system. But I mean, the question there is very much with regards to the COVID-19 relief. Yes, it was previously implemented by SARS. It was highly effective and highly beneficial to the taxpayer, to the SME. But for those businesses affected by the recent riots, will there be something of a similar nature, maybe a riot relief? And, SARS hasn't issued any statement in that regard. But very much, SASRIA has actually said that at this stage, from what they can see, they're anticipating about 20 billion in claims, and they don't have the capital for that. So this is very much a balancing of the benefit versus the harm. And at this stage, the benefit of all of this relief, the COVID relief and, potential riot relief, actually outweighs the harm quite significantly.
Yeah, and I think, the idea that businesses need to remain viable through interruptions is something that is well understood. But sometimes people struggle when the intervention or the assistance has to come from the state, because then the question of, well, who do you prioritize and on what basis do you prioritize them becomes a bit of a difficult one, doesn't it? Particularly when we have so many businesses that are outside the formal net where you don't find them with the same compliance profile. So even if there's R1 billion to be distributed tomorrow, we leave them out.
Yeah, so that's very correct. So in terms of reclaiming that, I mean, as you know, SASRIA insures probably about 90% of businesses across South Africa, with or without employees being aware of it. But the real question is that, in terms of that, is there a set criteria within which these claims are formed? Is there a hierarchy? So, for example, with the liquidation of an estate, for example, you'd have your different categories of creditors. But does the same ring true for these small to medium enterprises who are trying to claim some sort of relief from SASRIA? And I mean, since March 2020, many of these SMEs have had to shut their doors for good as a result of the economic lockdown across South Africa, resultant from the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of them, they were holding on by a thread, and then the riots of last week came, and that was very much the last straw. So how will this work? How will it work going forward? Who gets that first slice of the pie, in essence?
Yeah. In relation to the question of the taxes that every business is subjected to, I suppose what we heard yesterday was simply the government saying that, wait, when you pay somebody a particular salary, you then have to withhold taxes on their behalf and pay it over to Sars. However, you now have this option of delaying that payment by a few months. Is that the accurate reflection of what the government said yesterday?
Yeah, so that's also another form of relief. So from a tax perspective, and this is not focusing on deferred assets or deferred liabilities from an accounting perspective, but very much from a tax perspective, as was the message relayed yesterday. In terms of deferring that payment, a similar mechanism was previously available to businesses. And we've actually seen it over the last year and a half in light of the COVID pandemic, where many businesses have not been in a position to pay their PAYE or their VAT obligations to Sars. And Sars has then subsequently been approached for a deferral of payment, in essence, whereby it gives the business almost a payment holiday, if I can call it that. It gives them a few months to actually recuperate funds to be able to pay Sars. And those payments are then made in monthly installments. So, for example, if the business owed Sars 250,000, Sars would not expect it in a single payment, but rather 5 payments of 50,000. Or alternatively, and what we've actually seen is that there's another relief mechanism known as the compromise of tax debt. And in this instance, businesses who are not able to honor their PAYE and their VAT obligations to Sars at this point in time, and that's obviously due to financial constraints on the business or a decline in the market in light of COVID-19, have been able to approach Sars for a reduced settlement amount. So in the same scenario, if they owed 250,000 to Sars as at today, yet in terms of profitability and going concern perspective, they're not able to pay that in full. They can very much approach Sars with an offer as a reduced settlement amount, with Sars showing the mercy on the taxpayer to actually write off the remainder, which is unaffordable, and allows the business to continue as a going concern.
Yeah. One of the key points that has emerged in relation to PAYE, for example, is that obviously there is a risk that the reason the business is using that concession, the reason the business is actually taking up this option of deferring its payment is that the business is struggling. What happens then if the business doesn't survive beyond those 3 months and actually doesn't have the money to pay the Sars liabilities, given the fact that it actually was paying it on my behalf as an employee?
Yes, so this very much goes back to the business would then have that liability, all right? And from a legal perspective, the business obviously cannot be formally deregistered while there's non-compliance on Sars' side. So it's at this stage that the directors of a business or a failed business, as the case may be, would actually approach Sars to reduce that liability and allow them to then settle it. Because we have seen instances where Sars actually proceeds against the employee on this basis that, you know what, we never received the PAYE from the company. However, that being said, it's very circumstantial, as in some instances the PAYE may have been withheld. However, the employer decided that it was more feasible to use that for next month's salaries. And these are all very real concerns in today's economy, and Sars actually do take cognizance of that. And it's actually very much viewed from a moralistic perspective that the employer took the correct decision for his employees to continue employing, for example, 20 employees instead of retrenchments and pay cuts. And that's where Sars has very much, they've really stepped up, and they've shown that they're willing to amicably settle these matters and reduce the liability to an amount that's affordable to either the company should it continue running, or, as you mentioned, 3 months down the line, the company shuts its doors, to the company's directors. Because as you're aware, from a company perspective, the liability will then fall onto the directors in most instances.
Sure. Yeah. And I suppose it's one of those areas where the question of SARS discretion comes in. But I suspect many people will say we are much clearer when the rules and the principles are straightforward. When discretion has to be applied, has SARS then come up with some guidelines of how they can actually verify that actually what I say as an employer is indeed a reflection of the facts? Can they then say, wait, hold on, how are you arguing that you cannot pay your employees and yet your own personal estate is worth XYZ? What are the principles under which this discretion is applied?
So in terms of that discretion being applied, there is a very heavy documentary burden that is placed on the taxpayer with regards to any of these arrangements, whether it's the compromise or the deferral of payment in the case of a going concern. And that evidentiary burden extends very much to, financial statements and bank statements. And then there's always the question, and this is a question that has to be asked by SARS, and that is, was there mismanagement of funds by the directors? And in that instance, that is very much where we would engage SARS and, in essence, have a roundtable with them, discuss with them. And at the end of it, if need be, SARS would then meet with the directors and they would have to issue statements with this regard. But what we have seen is that generally, if the management accounts do not reflect any inconsistencies, then SARS is very much open to a more full discussion, a more concrete discussion on how to best assist the taxpayer, because it must be borne in mind that in light of the last year and a half, where we've seen immense restrictions across all business areas, that SARS has obviously not received as much tax as they generally would, which has resulted in a deficit to the fiscus. And that being said, that's greatly impacted many state ventures. So SARS, yes, they are aggressive in their collection measures and they've greatly ramped up the strength of it. But if SARS is correctly engaged, and more so from a compliance and willingness perspective than anything else, then they are amicable to having these discussions and reaching a settlement. And in the event where SARS issues, for example, a final demand to the taxpayer, which we see very often now for amounts as little as 5,000 and going up to 5 million, at that stage, SARS very much needs to be legally engaged in order to prevent any collection measures being taken, because it's quite easy for a judgment to be issued by SARS. It's a written statement by a senior SARS official, it goes down to court, it's certified as a judgment. The problem with that is it's treated as a judgment, but it's not a judgment, which means it cannot be formally rescinded in terms of the rules of the High Court. So aside from that, we've also seen attachments of bank accounts. Outright, client goes to sleep one night, they wake up the next morning, there's 150,000 missing from their account. And all of these measures are actually catered for in that final demand, but very few taxpayers will read that fine print at the bottom. And Kaya, as you know, how often do any of us read the fine print on purchase or anything? And that's actually to the detriment of the taxpayer. So legal engagement is very important in these matters.
Yeah, it's definitely quite key, particularly at a point in time where the rules seem to be responsive to the crisis at hand rather than being static. Now, one of the key questions that emerged yesterday relating to the liquor industry is the deferral of excise duties. Now, of course, that is a different way of taxing people, because for everything else, the trigger will be, have you made the money that actually enables you to pay SARS? But when it comes to excise duty, you're not selling anything, and yet SARS has an expectation. Weird, isn't it?
Yeah, so remember, there you must very much look at receipt versus accrual, and as a basic principle of tax. And you'll see there's also a great overlap into accounting, whereas accounting works more on the receipt side of it, so the money is actually on hand. Tax very much works on the accrual side of it. And the interlinkage between accounting and tax is there. However, so under accounting, for example, right, accounting, in terms of the IFRS, it looks more like substance over form. Whereas from the tax perspective, it's more the income tax and looking at the legal form of it. So it's really a profit versus taxable income. So very much what happens there is, there you're looking at, something almost similar to the accounting principle of deferred tax, right? So in essence, deferred tax is an accounting measure, and it it pertains more to the future tax consequences of recovery or settlement of any carrying amounts for assets and liabilities. So from that perspective, in terms of the IAS 12, the income taxes, that needs to then be included on the balance sheet because the IAS 12 looks at a comprehensive balance sheet method which accounts for income taxes for current and future consequences, transactions, and events. And this is looking at it from a very holistic perspective because the deferred tax would then be recognized on the statement of financial position because accounting recognizes both assets and liabilities for future and present obligations.
Yeah, quite an important distinction there. When it comes to all these deferrals, of course, the key question that then emerges is what are the risks? And I know generally that if you miss your PAYE deadlines and if you meet your VAT deadlines, penalties immediately start kicking in, interest immediately starts kicking in. Have we seen Sars then putting together some regulations or some guidelines to say, wait, hold on, we know exactly why you are late this month or for these next 3 months, so therefore we're not going to hit you with an increased bill 3 months later to then say you're actually late? Because in the absence of that particular concession, it will be self-defeating, wouldn't it?
Yes, so we actually have not. We have not seen anything of that nature. So generally what happens with these matters is there may be a halt on the penalties and interest in the event where SARS is engaged on a dispute, but that is very circumstance dependent. In the general course of things, the interest and penalties continue to run, and at the end of the dispute or the compromise or the deferral, as it may be, that is when those issues are very much tackled. And what we've seen from this perspective, and in terms of a favorability perspective to the taxpayer, is that when they're late and they're struggling to play catch up, in essence, the most favorable relief there has actually been the compromise rather than a dispute. And that is because the interest and penalties are then waived upon finalization of that process.
Yeah, and I think obviously that type of concession is remarkably important for people that may be engaging in this. I mean, here we are now, we have this particular crisis moment where SARS has had to learn to adapt and do things differently and meet taxpayers halfway. Are we seeing a lot of taxpayers coming through and saying, actually, this is a concession that's benefiting us? Or, as some people have said, actually, the companies that are supposed to benefit from it have probably been decimated anyway?
Yeah, so I mean that's the thing. It's been highly beneficial, not just to companies but also to individual taxpayers, because it must be borne in mind that in the recent year, we've seen retrenchments, we've seen pay cuts, and from the retrenchment side, your tax obligation goes away for the periods you're unemployed. However, with regards to the pay cuts, your tax obligation is slightly reduced, but your salary is greatly reduced. Therefore, it's a bigger chunk coming out, and that's like another 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 rand that could have been used to put food on the table. That's now being paid over to SARS and not made up on the after-tax income side, on your net side.
Mm.
So with regards to the benefits, I mean, ideally, it's the whole purpose of these compromises, these deferrals, etc., is to aid companies as well as individual taxpayers. But the companies more in remaining a going concern. And a very key aspect here is the aspect of financial hardship.
Yeah. Now, I think it's a remarkably important consideration that we do need to keep these companies viable in one way or another. And I think if we see a lot of them falling foul simply because they're saying SARS kept knocking, then it will actually mean that we have a much greater burden thanks to increased unemployment and some of those unavoidable consequences, I suppose, of all of these things. So after the deferral of the taxes will indeed be due and payable, guys. But from what we hear, that there's probably now a way of negotiating and coordinating your tax affairs in a way that doesn't become a pinch on the pocket, because I think that is probably quite critical. Thank you very much to Jashwin Baijoo, who is a legal manager for Africa Tax and Compliance at Tax Consultancy SA.